It's Dr. Jim Malley,
That's right.
and you're a professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of New Hampshire.
Correct.
Excellent. And you've specialized in research regarding UV issues?
Right. Public health, disinfection, and a lot of it on ultraviolet for water and for healthcare acquired infections.
Let's talk about UV because the public probably really doesn't understand.
Okay, there are four ranges of ultraviolet frequencies, A, B, C, and vacuum that we typically work with. Yeah.
Okay, and so sunlight and sunscreen, as I recall, is that UVB?
Yeah, so the way people think about it is sunlight is primarily UVA and UVB. That UVC in sunlight never gets to the earth because of the ozone layer.
Right.
And so most people would say sunlight is roughly 95% UVA and 5% UVB, and they're not particularly germicidal.
Let's talk about UVC, which is the germicidal
Correct.
usage. And this has been around in hospitals, as I understand it, for a long time.
That's right, and you look back through the history, UV for drinking water disinfection in France, over 100 years old, hospitals, probably 30 years, 40 years, and more importantly, I would say the last 10 to 15 years, healthcare acquired infections have been a big deal financially to hospitals, so it's been very active in the last 10 to 15 years, yeah.
And there's, as I understand, there's several ways of generating UVC at the right frequency.
Yes.
These, as I read, mercury vapor lamps. And,
right. So,
and also LEDs.
Yeah. The vast majority of products on the consumer market, you see them in your Facebook stream or in your eBay or in your Instagram, they're rubbish. They really have none of the fundamental understanding of how UV works. One of the reasons that's proliferating is the UV surface or the UV air or the UV object disinfection market is basically the Wild West. It's not regulated. There's no consumer validation. There's no seal of approval from National Sanitation Foundation or Underwriters Laboratory. So it's the Wild West. Nobody's even really sure who regulates it. Is it EPA? Is it FDA? Is it Federal Trade Commission? So the device is often not backed up by any research and development at all. And as I say, the vast majority on the list, I have 145 on my Excel spreadsheet list, the vast majority of them are not doing the job.
I was looking at traveling and the problem for travelers with hotel rooms.
Yes. Yeah.
So and I talked to a manufacturer in Florida, and they're making, I think, a couple feet high gizmo, just like a heater, that generates both ozone and UV, I think at 254.
Yep.
And they said it'll do 600 square feet in an hour. Just leave it in the room. Don't be there when it does it because of the O3, the ozone. And it'll kill the virus. And there's a level, evidently, that they've reached, and they've also got sensing tabs that you can place around a room to see how much UV level there was. So does this, as a scientist, does this make sense to you?
Right, so this has definitely been around a long time, different versions of this. And as you were saying, it's the surgical suite model where you're disinfecting a surgical suite, particularly surgical suites that are doing joint replacement, knee and hip. They're very worried about secondary infection in those zones because now we've got titanium and no blood flow in there, so we can't fight an infection in a replaced knee or a hip. So basically what you're talking about in a more elaborate case is we do the dry cleanup that's always done, we do the wet wash or wet cleanup that's always done, and then we bring into this surgical suite or even this patient's hotel room a patient's hospital room or extended to a hotel room now. And like you said, we have a whole bunch of different dosimeter badges. They look like Post-it notes.
Right.
And we have them in the lab right now, square, circular, rectangular, triangle, you name it. And we put them in strategic locations in the room. And then you go ahead and you dose the room with the robots, or some do it manually with they put on their proper personal protection and they walk along with a little cart dosing the walls, the desks, the beds, whatever. Very good multiple barriers. So public health engineers are generally trained. We put in as many different barriers to disease as we can. That way, if a couple of them break down, there's still a safety net. So dry wash, wet wash, UV dose should work extremely well. There's definitely going to be some issues, though. Anything that is going to block the UV, anything that's in shadow, if it's a very sorbent bedspread, any kind of very sorbent material, the virus will get in, be shielded from UV, and then come out at different rates, desorb off the bedspread or whatever. So never going to be perfect, but right now we advocate, whether it be a hotel room, a hospital suite, a new classroom, a classroom opening up after this quarantine, dry wash, wet wash, UV dosing of the surfaces is our threefold barrier to COVID-19. So that's currently the thinking. Yeah.
What's a dry wash?
Normally people just go in with their vacuums, duster, dust, vacuum, that sort of thing. Get the particles up.
Does that work?
Well, it's necessary if you're going to use UV or any chemical, because these particles, this dirt, is going to interfere with disinfection. So think of it as a necessary pre-treatment or a necessary precursor.
So what's the safety if I was going to stay in a hotel room, for example, because this may affect a lot of people that choose to drive rather than fly.
Yes.
So if you want to be safe in a hotel room, if you take a portable handheld vacuum cleaner and some wipes, antiseptic wipes, and then leave a UV generator go for an hour, you think that's safe?
Well, that's a good question. The other thing we do as public health engineers is we have to somehow define safe.
Right.
And so in the water field for decades, we have said safe means less than one additional infection per 10,000 people consuming the water. So if we're trying to set up some risk level, let's say same risk, 10 to the minus 4, let's say 1 in 10,000.
Okay.
Then I think if we were to put together all these different things, if we were to say that the room hasn't been occupied for several hours, the housekeeping has come in and done dry cleanup, wet wash, probably dry in the bedspreads and the carpet, and then wet in the bathroom and the mirrors and the surfaces, and then you were to do one of these devices, especially if you were going to put little indicators, little dosimeter badges to make sure it was being done correctly, I think you've basically started to knock your risk way down. Could you be incredibly unlucky? Absolutely, you can still get it, but we're getting their level of comfort issue. How many, do you fly in a plane with 2 engines or 1 engine? It's that kind of thinking, you know what I mean? But I do think the hotel's got to do most of it, because the other thing I don't encourage is most consumers they're not going to have the attention span, they're not going to have the knowledge, the patience, because again, you cannot see the UV light that's doing the inactivation, you cannot see the virus, you can't smell it, can't hear it, so we have no human sense that we're going to do a good job. It's like painting with an invisible paintbrush, right? So although I do agree with some of the estimates that you read that this machine in so much time will cover so much space, it still needs to be verified. So I'd be much happier if you told me the hotel is bringing in a trained team and they're going to decon that room before the next guest moves in, than if I said the actual traveler has to do it himself.
Yeah, well, some may be doing it, but it's a function of money.
Oh yeah, no, I hear you. I hear you. Absolutely, absolutely. It's what will the market bear, right? What will the traveler be willing to do?
So, Jim, with the dosimeters, what kind of dose measurements do you know that it's effective? Is there any standard?
No, not even close. That's the $1 million question, and quite honestly, that's why it's been rather frustrating to all of us that somebody meaning a regulatory agency isn't stepping up and saying you need this amount of login activation, because if that was said, then we can back calculate a dose. And that's what we do in the water world. But what I've been doing for surfaces that I think is defensible, we have a fairly resistant surrogate called MS2, as I mentioned. We know that with a dose of 100 millijoules per centimeter squared, that's our typical units for UV dose,
Right.
we're going to get 4 log or 99.99% inactivation of this very resistant microbe MS2. That suffices for our drinking water. So I'm saying if we deliver 100 millijoules per centimeter squared to the surface, and we do have dosimeter badges that will measure that quite nicely. They're actually very good badges. I've been testing a bunch of them in my lab. I'm saying deliver 100, with a little luck, you're 50 times higher than you need it to be. But again, I'm just Jim Malley. I wish this would be FDA or CDC or somebody would come out and actually codify this, because the market is the Wild West, we just have to be careful, because we have devices that have been reported to the FTC because they're not UV lamps at all.
Right.
We have, and that's true of, wipes and hand sanitizer that has methanol.
Yeah, look at the alert that just came out.
Yeah. So unfortunately, all of those consumer product markets are pretty loosely regulated. But if you've got a reputable firm that has a track record, that has some liability, it's not going to be here today, gone tomorrow, and they're doing it correctly, I think you're in okay shape.
So, Jim, if the public buys generators that work at 222 nanometers, is that they can run all the time? Is that much safer, I'm assuming, than 253?
No, we don't have, that's a really good question. In fact, the International UV Association has just kind of put out a white paper asking some, questions, putting out some good academic debate on this whole 222 versus 253 or 254. I'm going to say a couple of things that I think the peer-reviewed literature supports. Certainly, 222 is much higher probability of generating ozone than 254, based on the absorption of oxygen. 222 has got some really good peer-reviewed work on its skin and eye with mice and with eye models, but Australian work suggests 222 still causes skin cancer, which the mice models do not suggest. The Australian work used human volunteers. So I think 222 has got some great stuff going for it. The Columbia University research team is top-notch, but we still want to keep the dose of 222 well below the American Council of Government Industrial Hygienists recommendations. So if you use 222 and you're going to be in the room with it, your exposure time is usually far less than 2 or 3 minutes, and then you're over the government hygiene dose. So I think, unfortunately, there's a lot more to do with 222. I think it's got great promise, don't get me wrong. I think there's some really cool stuff about it, but I think when it is brought before public health experts and industrial hygienists, I think there needs to be more research. I think whenever you're going to expose humans directly, I think we've got to give it a much more rigorous, I'll call it a clinical trial.
So if I left a 254 generator on, for example, in our lab or in my condo, does it have any health risks to me?
Are you in there or no?
If let's say I was.
Yeah, I think 254 undoubtedly, and we try to put as many warning signs on it as we can. UVC in general, but UV 254 has an even less tolerable dose, industrial hygienist wise, than 222 does. So it will tie almost immediately to damage of the skin cells. There's some debate whether it really causes cancer or not, but there's definitely damage. There's definitely change in the morphology of the cells. The damage to the cornea is, nobody's arguing with that. It definitely happens. So definitely UV254, and we've kind of known this for 100 years, damages human tissue, and we want to avoid that. The problem, I think, is 222 probably does also, even though the mouse models and the very good research shows that it's less damaging than 254.
So if somebody were going to buy one of the lamps, 222 would be best in non-occupied area.
Yeah, I think as long as we get more data on the lamps, in terms of energy efficiency and lamp life, I could see using a UV222 in a closed setting with the door locked off. But also the 254 market is well established as well. So I think no one's really taken the two of them head to head. For example, there's another very common source that I haven't mentioned called a flash lamp. And they're on the market, xenon flash lamps.